Welcome to our fourth topic of IB Biology, looking at ecology. In this video, we're going to be looking at species, communities and ecosystems, and it's going to be the first section of 4.1. So in this section, in this video, we're going to be looking at the nature of science and our understandings. Now, before we start looking at ecology, it's very important to understand that in living organisms on planet Earth, we have a hierarchy. So we start off with that basic cell as that smallest unit of life, and that then moves through a hierarchy right up until our biomes, and then our biomes joining together to create all the places, so our biosphere, all the places on Earth where there's living organisms. So it's really important to be able to get your head around that hierarchy, because in there we do get the population, our community, our habitat, our ecosystem, and our biome, and then biosphere. And these are all important terms that you need to be aware of as we go into this ecology unit. Okay, so when we study ecology, we are looking at the study of the relationships between living organisms and their environment, and between the organisms within that environment. So we're looking at populations, we're looking at the ecosystem, we're looking at communities, species, and habitats. So it's really important that you have an understanding of these words or terms. Okay, so we're going to start off looking at species. Now, species are groups of organisms that can potentially interbreed to produce our fertile offspring. So when we look at these pictures here, we've got different breeds of sheep, but they're all the same species. So they can interbreed and then produce young. Now, many members of a species have a common gene pool. Okay, the members of the same species have the same family tree, so phylogeny. Recognition of members of the same species may be achieved by displays, dances, songs, calls, displays of colour, by scent. So different breeds within a species know each other, okay, or members of a species know that they're the same species through some of these recognition techniques. This ensures that only members of the same species can reproduce. Now, there are some challenges to this species definition. Sometimes crossbreeding may occur, but the offspring there will generally be infertile. So two different species, in the off chance that they can breed, their offspring will be infertile. We'll look at some examples of that in a second. And this ensures that the gene pool of each species is maintained and not mixed. So if they do interbreed and you get offspring, that offspring can't then contaminate their gene pool as such by then breeding on. So some examples of that would be the mule. And the mule is produced when a horse and a donkey mate. The mule is infertile, okay, because the horse and the donkey are two different species. With dogs, not all breeds of dogs can physically interbreed because of their size, okay, but all breeds can reproduce with intermediate size breeds. So there's only one gene pool as such and one species. So dogs of different breeds can reproduce, but it just depends on size. Okay, now members of a species may be reproductively isolated in separate populations. So when we look here, we're looking at some different fish and we're looking at some sinkholes. Now, fish in one sinkhole are reproductively isolated from fish in another sinkhole because fish can't walk across land. So a population, so we've got to think, when we think of that top statement there, members of a species may be reproductively isolated in separate populations, there's some keywords there. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species that lives in the same area at the same time. Now, if two populations are isolated, living in different areas, they're very unlikely to interbreed. So, for example, our fish in the two different sinkholes, they're the same species, but their populations are isolated. So this does not mean that they're different species, as they could interbreed if their rock between the two sinkholes broke down. They could interbreed if they came together. So they are the same species because they could interbreed. So we're looking here, this image is showing us that original population. We've got some geographical isolation, so the two species are separated somehow. We've got the big circle and the small circle. Okay, so they can't interbreed, they're geographically isolated, and through that we've got speciation. So one of the species has actually altered. So if two populations never interbreed because of isolation by physical features such as deserts, mountains, oceans, then they may gradually develop differences in their characteristics. They will still be the same species as long as they can interbreed. Now, over time, that may stop and they may not be able to interbreed because they may actually change some characteristics there. So those differences before you get to that speciation stage, the populations will have very different characteristics and would not recognise each other if they came across each other. So remembering that they need to recognise each other to breed. And then they become two different species. Okay, so we've looked at that area of species and what species is. Now, our next area of study is looking at types of nutrition. And you would have heard these two terms before, autotroph and heterotroph, because I've already taught you these terms, especially autotroph when we was looking at photosynthesis. Okay, so autotrophs, they are self-feeders. Okay, so they use light energy. They're our plants, light energy to synthesize that food, whereas the heterotrophs, they need to digest, they need to consume food. Alrighty, so we've got these two different feeding types, autotrophs, heterotrophs. Then underneath that, we do have different pathways. So our autotrophs are always our producers. Now they can be that photoautotrophy. Now we've not gone into this step, but this is just some awareness for you. Okay, now so our producers that use photosynthesis are photoautotrophy, but we also get chemoautotrophy, and these are those deep sea creatures that can't actually get light energy. So they use chemosynthetic bacteria. They use chemicals to produce their food. Then we have heterotrophy. These are our consumers and our decomposers. Okay, and we're going to be looking at these in more detail. So our autotrophs, first of all. Organisms that are capable of making their own organic molecules as a food source. Oops, can't speak. They are able to synthesize organic molecules from simple organic substances in the process of photosynthesis. So we've looked at our photosynthesis, okay, and that being that carbon dioxide and water, with the addition of our chlorophyll and our light energy to form that complex carbohydrate, our glucose, and the oxygen that's released. So we've looked at that process of photosynthesis. Some examples of autotrophs, we've got our cyanobacteria, algae, grass, trees, so anything that photosynthesizes. So our autotrophs are our producers, but also remembering that there are this other group, our chemotrophs, okay? Just remembering that they do also exist. Okay, so some exceptions. Most plants and algae obtain their nutrition by synthesizing organic matter to form our inorganic molecules. However, there are always exceptions and discrepancies to these trends. So these keywords, exceptions and discrepancies. Some species that have recognizable plant characteristics do not photosynthesize but grow on other plants and obtain their carbon compounds by causing them harm. So parasitic plants we're looking at. Okay, so they grow on other plants and they use their carbon compounds instead of photosynthesizing themselves. So these images are all showing you some different parasitic plants. To decide whether parasitic plants falsify the theory that plants and algae are autotrophic, we need to look at some evidence. We're looking at this falsifying. The number of parasitic plants and algae is relatively small. There's only about 1%. The ancestral species of these plants and algae were almost certainly autotrophic, but they've evolved then to become parasitic. Because the number of parasitic species is diverse, it indicates that they evolved repeatedly from photosynthetic species. So that's our falsification of a theory. Alrighty, our heterotrophs are our consumers now. So heterotrophs are organisms that cannot make their own food from organic matter and must obtain organic matter from other organisms. They get their chemical energy from autotrophs or other heterotrophs. Heterotrophs ingest organic matter that is living or has recently been killed, so they consume it. Because they rely on other organisms for food, we call them the consumers. And we've got some examples here, our zooplankton, fish, sheep, insects, humans. We've got a lovely praying mantis or something there eating a fly. Alrighty, so we've said there's these different nutrition types. Now, I'm going to introduce you to this whole concept of trophic levels. We've talked about consumers. Okay, so consumers ingest their food, they take in undigested food material from other organisms, digest it, absorb those nutrients. Consumers are sometimes divided into trophic groups, okay, according to what organisms they eat. Primary consumers feed on autotrophs. Secondary consumers feed on primary consumers. Tertiary consumers feed on secondary consumers, etc. Now, you would have done this back in Year 7 science. However, most consumers do not neatly fit into a trophic level. So you would have looked at basic food chains and food webs, and nothing is ever that simple with ecology, okay? So let's have a look at each group a bit more. We've got our detrivores. Now, these are cool little guys, okay? These obtain organic matter from detritus by internal digestion. Now, detritus is dead organic matter, leaves, hair, feces, carcasses. They love all that stuff. Some examples of detrivores include earthworms, woodlice, dung beetles. Now, detrivores are heterotrophs. They are ingesting organic matter. Let me introduce you to saprotrophs. Okay, these are heterotrophs that will gain their organic nutrients from dead organic matter by external digestion. They secrete digestive enzymes to the dead organic matter and digest it externally. So they don't eat it as such, they don't take it in, they absorb it. They play an important role in the decay of dead organic material because they break down carbon compounds and release the elements such as nitrogen and carbon back into the ecosystem so they can be then used again. If we didn't have our saprotrophs and our detrivores, we would have a lot of dead things around us. Now, saprotrophs are called decomposers. Got some examples, fungi and some bacteria. Alrighty, so we've looked at species and we've looked at types of nutrition. Now we're going to look at communities and ecosystems. And you see there, I've got our hierarchy again, going from that individual to the population, community, ecosystem, biome, and biosphere. All right, so what is a community? A community is formed by populations of different species living together and interacting together. Now, interacting can mean one population feeding on another or being eaten, okay? It could be one species providing vital substances for another, e.g. symbiotic bacteria, which helps plants to obtain nitrogen while the bacteria grow in the nodules in the roots. One species getting protection for another. For example, our clownfish there living amongst stinging coral polyps. One species relying on another species for a habitat. So that's our whole concept of symbiosis as well there. All right, ecosystems. So what is an ecosystem? Now, a community forms an ecosystem by interactions with its abiotic environment. Okay, so remember you've got abiotic and biotic environments. This is the image is showing stresses, but those things are our factors as well. So abiotic is non-living, biotic is living. So our ecosystem is our community interacting with our non-living factors in the environment. Now, these organisms depend on their non-living abiotic surroundings of air, water, soil and rock. Without them, the organism would not live there. Sometimes living organisms, so the biotic factors, can have an impact on that abiotic environment. An example of that is tree roots that penetrate and break apart rock, while the roots can also hold together soil, preventing it from being blown away. So there's a real interaction between the biotic and the abiotic factors. Okay, when we're measuring abiotic factors in an ecosystem, they can include things such as temperature, pH, light levels, relative humidity, hours of sunshine, rainfall, salinity of soil, many other factors. We've got some different factors there on our diagram as well. Abiotic factors can impact on an organism. For example, wave action on a rocky shore. So if you've got the waves hitting against a rocky shore, it impacts what organisms will live there. All right, we're now going to have a look into nutrient cycling, and we will go into this further in a separate unit. Our autotrophs obtain all their inorganic materials or nutrients from the abiotic environment, okay, and then they convert these to their organic compounds. So nutrients include that carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and 15 other essential elements. Heterotrophs obtain most of their nutrients by consuming other organisms. So they use these for growth, respiration, releasing inorganic byproducts. They do obtain inorganic nutrients such as sodium, potassium and calcium from their abiotic environment. So you've got to think of all the different essential elements that an organism needs, okay? So you might have heard that, for example, humans, we need magnesium, okay, for healthy muscle growth and to help with our nervous system, okay? We can get that through eating certain things, okay, which are magnesium rich, okay? Now, when we're looking at nutrient cycling, we need to remember that Earth is a closed system, okay? The mass on Earth of all of the elements, okay, is what's there. All of these elements get cycled, okay? So the amount of matter will always remain the same because we are a closed system. Energy flows through a system, but the nutrients are recycled, okay? So Earth does lose energy in the form of heat, okay, off into the atmosphere, into space. But we don't lose any of our nutrients. They're just being recycled on Earth. As a result, ecosystems must recycle carbon, nitrogen and other elements and compounds necessary for life to exist. And we'll look at some of those cycles. Organisms absorb the elements that they require as inorganic nutrients from the abiotic environment. They use them and then they return them to the environments with atoms unchanged. So the actual initial atoms of each element, they don't change. These cycles are often very complex, but the important message is that nutrients can be recycled almost indefinitely, unlike energy, which is not recycled and must be constantly supplied to Earth by the sun. Okay, so looking at a bit now about sustainability. Something's sustainable if it can continue indefinitely. Natural ecosystems are sustainable if nutrients are available, so that's that recycling. Detoxification of waste, so breaking down by other organisms, that things that can be used as a food source, denitrifying bacteria using the nitrogenous waste, such as urea. Okay, so we've got to get rid of those waste products. We've got to break them down so they're no longer dangerous. Energy availability. Okay, energy cannot be recycled, so we've got to have a continuous supply of energy into our ecosystems, and that is through that sunlight. Okay, this brings us to a topic that we know quite well, and sustainability of our ecosystems. I mean, you see there, we've got a little, that's actually a mesocome. Okay, so producers take inorganic compounds such as carbon dioxide and transfer them into our organic compounds such as glucose. They use these monosaccharides to form polysaccharides such as starch and cellulose. They also add other nutrients to make organic molecules such as lipids and proteins. You see how this is all coming together now. Consumers then eat the producer, and the complex molecules then get digested into smaller monomers such as glucose and amino acids, whichever the the consumer requires. Now, when the consumer dies, their cells are then broken down by digestive enzymes or decomposers, and the nutrients are returned to the soil. So there you go. You see how we're now bringing together information from topics 1 and 2 and really building on that as we look at this whole topic of ecosystems. I'll see you in the second part of this video, which is based on our skills and application.